about testing of REST APIs with a tool called Postman. And we'll be covering both manual testing and the automated testing or automation with Postman. And we'll cover some basic, beginner, intermediate, and advanced concepts with Postman. So here's a quick overview of the course outline. If you're not familiar with the REST APIs, what they are and what they're used for, that's okay. We're going to do a very quick, brief refresher on those, and we'll talk about REST APIs and HTTP requests and what is a JSON. And then we'll quickly talk about what Postman is. Then we'll get into setting up our environment and installing anything we need to use throughout the course. Then we'll cover testing of REST APIs with Postman with the manual approach by inspecting the response and also the automated approach by writing tests and having assertions on the responses. We'll cover some Postman features and then we'll get into how to run the automated Postman test in the continuous integration or continuous delivery pipelines using a tool called Newman. Now let's do a quick refresher on REST APIs. So what are REST APIs? So as you can see here within the context of this big red rectangle, we have a typical structure of a web application. So a web application usually consists of the UI or the front end part. Then we have our backend server, and then we have our database where we actually store our data or any user information or whatever our application needs in terms of data. So what happens is that in order for our front end part of the application or the UI to talk to the back end, we actually need a way for the communication to happen. This is where the REST API or Web API come into play because it's never a good idea for your front end of your application or the UI to write directly to your database. So this is where we actually insert the Web API. So Web APIs um, provide a mean of communication between the front end of our application and the server, which is our back end. And REST APIs are just HTTP requests that are made through the browser. They provide a mean to read and write data, so between the front end and back end of your application. They provide a security layer as well as if you have web APIs, you can also insert a level of validation and restrictions. So things that you don't want making it into your database or backend are caught or filtered on the API layer, and many more other advantages, but this is a very quick refresher. So for the REST API, we have certain methods. We have more methods than mentioned in this table, but we're just going to cover the basics here because the assumption is that you kind of know the basic of the fundamentals of REST API. This is just for people who want to follow along with the course and they don't have any context as to what it is. So we have certain methods and we have actions. So here's some very basic popular ones. So we have the get method, and that just retrieves resources from our backend. We have the post method, which is usually used to create resources. We have put or patch, which is used to change or modify certain resources or to replace the entire collection. And then we also have our delete, which deletes a resource from the backend. Now, for testing REST APIs, when you make an API call to access a resource in a certain way from the backend, you always get, when the call is finished, you always get a status code back. And the status code gives you a little bit of an information about how the call went and what were the results. So typically 200, there's a lot of different families within the 200. We have the 200, which means status is okay. We have 201, which means which when you're using a post request to create a resource, 201 tells you that the resource was successfully created. We have 400, which is typically when something goes wrong, 400 family sort of provides some sort of indication to you that there was something wrong with the call. So for example, 400 means that the resource, the request was actually bad. It was a bad request. Maybe there was something wrong with your URL or payload or something like that. Or 404 means that the resource was not found. Now, in order to get a little bit more familiar with the response codes that come back from the API, REST API requests, what you can do is you can just go to Google and search for HTTP response codes. And if you just search for that, there's a lot of available resources here to refer to. So for example, there's one available from Mozilla. We'll just go to the one from Wikipedia here. So if you just go ahead and click on that link, here it provides you a list of all the available HTTP status codes categorized by the family of that response code. So for example, we have the 100 family, so informational response, 100 means continue. And for each of these, there's a little bit of a description here that provides a lot of good details about what that particular status code means. So for example, here we have 200, which is referring to success. So 200 means okay, for example. So if you made a call and you got a 200 back, it means that that HTTP request was, the call was successful. 201 means that it was successfully created. So for example, if you're going to use a post call to create a resource, if you're getting back a 201 from the from your call, then it means everything went okay. And then we have the 300, which is referring to the redirection. We have the 400, which are referring to the 400 family is referring to the client errors. So for example, 400 is referring to a bad request. So maybe something you accidentally have a spelling mistake in your request URL, and or maybe the endpoint doesn't exist or something like that, then you're trying to access that resource, it'll throw a 400 because it's a bad request. 401 is unauthorized. So for example, you're trying to access a resource without providing an auth token, so you're not authorized, so you'll get a 401 back, and so on. So there's a 404 not found, and then there's a lot here, as you can see. And then there's the 500 server errors. So for example, if you're getting the for the 500 family, if you're getting a 500, it means there was an internal server error. And then again, as mentioned earlier, there's a description for each of these that you can refer to for your reference. On top of the status code, every time you make a HTTP request or you call an API, for example, let's say you're trying to do get a resource and you use the get call, you'll always get something back depending on how that call was implemented. And the way you get things back is in a JSON format, and JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And this is what we're going to use to validate some of the data or data accuracy things when testing APIs. So here's JavaScript, as mentioned again, JSON is a JavaScript object. So here's a very simple example what a JSON object looks like. So you have an object here, which is defined within the brackets here, and then you have a set of properties and values. So for example, here we have the name property and the value of that is John. We have the age property and we have the value of 45. Now notice the value for name is a string here in double quotes, but the value for age is not a string, it's a numeric or it's a number. So it's not, the types are different here. That's something to note. And then we have a property called car and the value is BMW. So this is a very typical JSON object that you can get back from different types of calls. Usually you get something like this back, or you can get a collection of objects back. So you can have an array that has multiple of these objects within it. Now, what is Postman? So Postman is a tool that helps us easily test REST APIs. And we could do that two ways. We could use Postman to test APIs manually, or we can use Postman to test things programmatically, so in an automated fashion. And another advantage with using Postman is it's free and there's a huge community behind it and it's well supported and it's being used by a lot of different people, including developers or test engineers or quality assurance engineers. And you can download the application for free and you can use it for free. Also, creating an account, which is something we're going to need for this course, is also free.